public is being conditioned to look at the sky. A $739 million SpaceX contract for missile defense is the latest accelerant. This launch-on-warning posture is not a strategy. It is a signal, a kinetic distraction. The mathematical certainty is that the primary vector of attack against the United States is not a ballistic missile. It is silence. The real war is being waged against the central nervous system of the American state. This system has two critical, silent vulnerabilities. First, the subsea data corridors. According to CSIS analysis, over 97% of global communications and trillions in daily financial transactions travel through a handful of undersea fiber optic cables. These are the arteries of global liquidity. They are fragile and they are exposed. Second, satellite blinding. Not destruction, which is a loud, kinetic event, but temporary, deniable dazzling. A non-state actor with sufficient resources, such as those profiting from instability in Venezuela or a Nigerian-style solvency crisis, can execute a non-kinetic strike that paralyzes GPS, intelligence gathering, and military command and control. This creates the blueprint for a new strategic nightmare, the blind Leviathan. A superpower armed to the teeth with kinetic weapons, yet rendered deaf, dumb, and blind. Unable to see the threat, unable to verify commands, unable to project power. The missile shield is insulation for a house whose foundation has already been washed away. The true systemic risk is the weaponization of silence. The motive is not ideology. It is solvency. A state, like a corporation, can become insolvent. According to detailed analysis from RUSI, Russia's kinetic action was not a discretionary show of force. It was a protocol triggered by an internal solvency crisis. The war's extreme unpopularity was metastasizing into a terminal domestic liability. The conflict became an external vector to manage internal collapse. A kinetic cost was incurred abroad to prevent a political default at home. This is the blueprint for state failure in the 21st century. When you can no longer afford your own social contract, you liquidate a neighbor's assets to service your own debt. This event demonstrates the core mechanism of the new era. As a state's conventional power erodes, its ability to afford symmetric, protracted conflict evaporates. Weakness forces a pivot. This is not a choice. It is a mathematical function of a declining balance sheet. The pivot is always toward asymmetry. When you can no longer control the system, you attack its pressure points with low-cost, high-impact vectors. Russia's solvency crisis is not an anomaly. It is the operating manual for how weakened states will behave as the global system fractures. The fundamental equation of modern warfare has inverted. Analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, quantifies this kinetic cost-benefit collapse. A $5 million main battle tank can now be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is a 10,000 to 1 negative cost imposition. The math does not lie. This is not an incremental change. It is a systemic phase shift known as the democratization of violence. The industrial-era monopoly on high lethality assets, once held exclusively by solvent nation-states, has been liquidated. The barrier to entry for kinetic projection has effectively dropped to zero. Consequently, non-state actors, like the armed militias establishing roadblocks in Venezuela, can now access and deploy disproportionate force. This creates an extreme asymmetric liability for legacy military powers. Every expensive centralized asset becomes a high-value target for a low-cost threat. The balance sheet of conventional warfare is now hopelessly insolvent. The operational theater has shifted. Forget nation-states. The new battle space is systemic. We are now in an era of proxy laboratories, controlled demolitions of peripheral economies to stress test financial and kinetic protocols for later deployment. These are not failures of governance. They are live fire exercises in systemic collapse. Examine the data. In Nigeria, the Naira's collapse to nearly 1,500 per dollar is not just a currency crisis, it is a liquidity vacuum. This vacuum creates the ideal conditions for a gray zone, a space where state control becomes a theoretical concept. Simultaneously, in Venezuela, the U.S. issues evacuation orders as armed militias, not the state, control critical infrastructure. These are non-state actors operating with impunity. These zones render traditional leverage obsolete. A 100% tariff threat against India is dismissed as an empty gesture because the global system no longer responds to a single economic hegemon. You cannot sanction a militia with a trade deal. According to analysts at CSIS, this impotence is the primary accelerant for the strategic pivot. The response is not to reclaim control of the system. That is no longer possible. The protocol has shifted to asymmetric insulation. The $739 million contract awarded to SpaceX for missile defense launches is the material evidence. It is the beginning of a hardened national perimeter. The state is no longer managing the globe. It is building a fortress against the kinetic blowback from a world it unleashed, but can no longer command. The state's final solvency test is not economic. It is its capacity to answer a first strike. This is the core logic of the launch on warning doctrine. As outlined by strategic analysts at RUSI, the protocol is mathematical. If early warning systems detect an inbound missile volley, a full-scale retaliatory strike is launched before the incoming warheads can detonate. It assumes a successful first strike is a zero-sum, existential event from which there is no recovery. This protocol, however, contains a systemic vulnerability. It assumes the integrity of its data. A sophisticated cyber attack, the primary vector in modern asymmetric warfare, does not need to physically destroy a silo. It only needs to blind the radar or feed it false positives. This is the fog of digital war, a state of engineered paranoia where the absence of information is interpreted as the worst-case scenario. The commander, facing a black screen, is forced into a binary choice with zero confirmation. Launch on the assumption of a decapitation strike, or wait and risk absolute annihilation. This is no longer a theoretical risk between nation-states. As state control fractures in territories like Venezuela, where armed militias now operate with impunity, source No. 4, the proliferation of advanced cyber weaponry to non-state actors becomes a mathematical certainty. The kinetic cost of miscalculation is total. This is the accelerant behind the state's pivot from global stabilization to asymmetric insulation. The $739 million contract for SpaceX to launch missile defense satellites, source No. 3, is not a projection of power. It is an admission of vulnerability, a shield against the blowback of a system where the fog of digital war is the new, permanent weather system. This isn't a mistake. It's the protocol. The protocol has pivoted from economic leverage to kinetic insulation. As U.S. financial threats become obsolete against mid-tier powers like India, and peripheral states like Nigeria suffer currency collapse, the system generates vacuums. These vacuums are filled by non-state actors, such as the armed militias establishing checkpoints in Venezuela, who operate below the threshold of traditional military response. The state's reaction is not to re-establish control, which is no longer possible, but to harden the core. The $739 million SpaceX contract for missile defense is not a projection of power. It is an admission of vulnerability. It is preparation for the terminal phase of systemic collapse, ignoring the initial asymmetric probes that will precede it. Analysts at CSIS project that before any launch-on-warning scenario, a calibration shot is a mathematical certainty. It must test U.S. response protocols, inflict maximum economic cost, and guarantee zero attribution. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a synchronized blackout targeting the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach complex. The event will be classified as a cascading grid failure, but it is designed as a non-kinetic decapitation of the U.S. logistics network. The objective is to trigger a solvency crisis, not a shooting war,